Hi everybody and welcome back to this week's video. And in this week's video we're going to be carrying on looking at the Jeremiah book. So we're going to look at the 46th chapter to see how the situation that sprung from Baruch expands into the people or more powerful nations we can see when it comes to their situations. So without further ado, thanking the Lord through our Savior Jesus Christ, let us begin with this week's video. So what did we see before we go into the 46th chapter in the 45th verse? As I mentioned before, we saw about Baruch, where God spoke personally to Baruch about talking about when in a situation where Baruch was troubled and felt defeated and felt quite saddened, we could say, he wished for greater things for himself. However, God made Baruch realize that in a time of judgment, we can see things for yourself should not be prioritized, we can see, and they should be preserved for this situation, we can see, because first of all, the situations around must be saved, in all honesty, we can see. And if you are and you have to be satisfied with the situation you are in right now, and only if you are satisfied with that right now will your life be preserved, we can see. And it's because of the judgment that God says that he should not, and for us as well, we should not focus on personal judgment, but on strengthening our faith to the Lord when we're in times of judgment, we can see, because it's through the faith, actually, if you think about it, that we're actually going to expound our own strength in whatever field the Lord allows it to be in. So that's where we left off in last week's video. So what do we see in this week's video in the Jeremiah 46th chapter? Well, of course, as I said it once again, the message becomes larger and it moves from one person in Baruch to a powerful nation. And we can see it starts off with the first 12 verses where it talks about Egypt's strength fails or will fail, we can see, as this chapter begins with the prophecy against Egypt, which is of course the strong and proud nation that we know about. It describes about a great battle, we can see, battle that happens near the Euphrates River, that it says. A battle is taking place near the river. And it said Egypt had a very powerful army when going into this battle, we can see. They were confident, they had their weapons and all their strength was fueled inside them and ready to fight. However, suddenly as it takes place, this war takes place or battle, they become afraid. They turn back and run away, and the mighty men of Egypt, the part of the strong and proud nation, are falling and running, we can say. And it kind of shows us how simplistic humankind is compared to the wealth and power God possessed, because no matter how strong human power may look, it cannot stand against God, for the God is all-knowing and all-powerful, we can see. Then, if we see the 13th to the 19th verse, we see about how it was not only just the idea of how God took advantage of the fact that he is the omnipotent, we can see, of course. It's the fact that the Egyptians also had pride. The Egypt, we can see in this situation, when in this battle, is actually compared to a river rising high, like the Nile in flood, we can see. They said I will rise and cover the earth. So we can see that pride and self-confidence completely takes over the people of Egypt when they are in that position of truly God can switch everything just like that. But of course, their pride is so high and their self-confidence, we can see, is so high to that point that they believe they can do anything, to the point of covering the whole earth. While we can see in terms of river, of course, how they were described as a river. In this situation, we can see of them conquering the whole world is what is trying to be conveyed, based on how the Egyptians believe in themselves so much. But God says the clear point, though, despite this, Egypt will be brought down. They will go into captivity. Those are the only words that are needed to help us understand that pride will fall one day. Because when people trust in themselves more than God, it is dangerous, and they will be humbled ultimately into the understanding that the Lord is the one pulling everything that allows them to survive and live. So then we move on to the next part. In the 20th to the 26th verse, God shows that Babylon will come from the north to defeat Egypt, we see. Egypt is like a beautiful animal, we can see, but it is said to have destruction incoming towards it. The enemy we see of Babylon is very, very large and cannot be stopped. Even the hired soldiers that were put in place for support turn back in fear. And it kind of shows how much power in this situation God gives to the army of Babylon, and it shows about how God controls the nations as he chooses who stays at the top, who rises, and who falls ultimately, as he is the one who decides who comes into power and who ultimately is destroyed. Then we see the 27th to the 28th verse, the two verses that shows about God's comfort for the people despite all of this. After he says this, after speaking about this judgment, God gives comfort to his people as he says, "Do not fear. I will save you from far away," he says. "I will not completely destroy you," he says. "I will not completely destroy you," he says. And this is very important for us to understand because the nations are judged and destroyed ultimately when it comes to the ultimate action of battle. However, God's people, there's a different outcome from battle. God's people are corrected, not destroyed. These trials of war are a physical lesson for discipline, not for destruction, to allow the people or allow his people to be redeemed. So what do we understand from this chapter as a conclusion? Well, we first saw about how to not seek greatness, where we saw that leading from the idea of the chapter 45, where we saw about Baruch and how he wished for that self-greatness, but of course God helped him understand. We saw about how human strength will ultimately fail, as it was said in the first 12 verses of the chapter, where it was said that ultimately human strength will fail because that is the power of God's will. And then we see into the nuances of how the strength actually fails. We see that pride leads to downfall. Self-confidence without God, we can see, is dangerous. And that's what the people of Egypt had, and they expected victory. And that is where their futility begins. And we can also see the other effects because of how God is the one who's in control of who stays in power and who stays on top, we can see. And we see the ultimate point of where God always supports his people, where he says God protects his people to provide them with comfort and realization and correction, but not to destroy them, like he says for the other nations, because this is his people and he wants the best for them. So that's all for this week's video, and I'll carry on talking about more about this in the Jeremiah 47th chapter in next week's video. See you then. Bye.